The mountain man's shadow fell across the dusty street like a prophecy, and Hannah Miller looked up from her leather-bound Bible to see him standing there with shoulders broad enough to block out the late afternoon sun. It was July 1876 in Shoshone City, Idaho, a rough mining town carved into the foothills where civilization met wilderness in an uneasy truce. Hannah had been sitting on the wooden bench outside the mercantile for the better part of an hour, her worn traveling dress gathering dust while she read the words of Solomon like they were written just for her. The other women passing by had whispered about her, voices carrying on the dry mountain air. "She reads the Bible like a love letter," Mrs. Patterson had said to Mrs. Crane, loud enough for half the street to hear. "It is not natural for a woman to be so fervent about Scripture." "Especially an unmarried woman, Mrs." Crane had added with a sniff. 22 years old and no husband. Just that old book." Hannah had ignored them, as she always did. The words on the page spoke to something deeper in her soul than these frontier women could understand. She traced her fingers over the verse about love being strong as death, and her heart swelled with a feeling she could not quite name. The shadow had not moved. Hannah finally raised her eyes fully and found herself looking at a man unlike any she had seen in the 3 weeks since the stagecoach had brought her to this remote town. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms corded with muscle that spoke of years spent wrestling with the wilderness itself. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord that had come loose on one side. A thick beard covered his jaw, but it could not hide the strong lines of his face or the startling blue of his eyes. "Madam," he said, his voice like gravel and honey mixed together, "I heard what those women said about you." Hannah's cheeks flushed. She clutched the Bible tighter to her chest, feeling suddenly vulnerable under his gaze. "I am sure half the town has heard by now. Gossip travels faster than wildfire in places like this." The mountain man shifted his weight, and Hannah noticed the hunting knife at his belt, the rifle slung across his back, the buckskin pants that disappeared into tall leather boots. He looked like he had stepped out of the mountains themselves, shaped by wind and stone and endless sky. "They said you read the Bible like a love letter," he continued, and something in his voice made Hannah's breath catch. "I have never read anything that way, never had cause to." "It is not so strange," Hannah said, finding her voice despite the rapid beating of her heart. "The Scriptures speak of love in all its forms, divine love, brotherly love, the love between man and woman. Why should I not read it with passion?" The mountain man was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those blue eyes that seemed to see past her defenses. Then he did something that shocked her to her core. He removed his wide-brimmed hat and sat down on the bench beside her, close enough that she could smell pine and wood smoke and something wild that clung to his clothes. "My name is Xander Calloway," he said. "I trap in the Sawtooth Mountains most of the year. Come down here when I need supplies or when winter gets too fierce even for me." "Hannah Miller," she replied automatically, still trying to process his proximity. No man in town had dared sit this close to her. Most gave her a wide berth, as if her devotion to Scripture might be contagious. "Miss Miller," Xander said slowly, rolling her name around like he was tasting it. "Would you teach me to read the Bible the way you do?" Hannah's eyes widened. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me right." He leaned back against the wooden slats, and the bench creaked under his considerable weight. "I can read well enough. My mother taught me before she died. But I have never read anything with the kind of feeling those women were talking about. If there is something in that book worth reading like a love letter, I want to know what it is." "Why?" The question escaped before Hannah could stop it. Xander turned to look at her fully, and the intensity in his gaze made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Because I have been alone in those mountains for 8 years, Miss Miller. Since I was 18 and decided I could not stomach living in civilization anymore. And in all that time, I have never once heard anyone describe anything the way those women described your reading. If you have found something worth that kind of devotion, maybe it is time I found it too." Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the Bible in her lap. The leather was soft from years of handling, the pages worn at the edges where she had turned them countless times. "I do not know if I can teach what comes from the heart, Mr. Calloway." "Xander," he corrected, and maybe you can try." She found herself nodding before she fully understood what she was agreeing to. There was something about this rough mountain man that called to a part of her she had kept carefully hidden. He did not look at her like she was strange or too fervent or unsuitable for polite society. He looked at her like she held the answer to a question he had been asking for years. "I was reading Song of Solomon," Hannah said softly, tilting the book so he could see the page. "It is poetry about love. Some say it is about the love between God and his people. Others say it is simply about the love between a man and woman. I think perhaps it is both." Xander leaned closer to read the words, and Hannah caught her breath at his nearness. His shoulder brushed against hers, solid and warm, and she could see the faint scar that ran along his jawline beneath his beard. "Read it to me," he said, "the way you were reading before I interrupted." Hannah swallowed hard and found the verse she had been contemplating. Her voice came out softer than she intended, but steady. "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord." She felt rather than saw Xander's reaction. His breathing had changed, deepened. When she dared glance at him, she found him staring at the page with an expression of wonder. "That is in the Bible?" he asked. "Yes." Hannah felt a small smile tug at her lips. "There is much in Scripture that might surprise you, Mr. Calloway." "Xander," she corrected herself, "read more." So she did. Hannah read to him of love and longing, of seeking and finding, of devotion that transcended understanding. She read until the sun began to sink behind the mountains, and the air took on the purple haze of evening. And Xander Calloway sat beside her the entire time, listening with an attention that made her feel like every word mattered. When she finally closed the book, her throat was dry and her voice hoarse. Xander stood and offered her his hand, and Hannah took it without thinking. His palm was calloused and rough, but his grip was gentle as he helped her to her feet. "Thank you," he said simply. "I would like to do this again, if you are willing." "I'm staying at the boarding house on 3rd Street, Hannah heard herself say. "Mrs. Dawson does not approve of me sitting outside and reading, but she tolerates it. I am usually here around this time each afternoon." "Then I will see you tomorrow, Hannah Miller." He said her name like a prayer, and Hannah felt something shift inside her chest. She watched him walk away down the dusty street, his long stride carrying him toward the edge of town where the wilderness began. She did not know what had just happened, only that her life had somehow changed in the course of a single conversation. That night, lying in her narrow bed at the boarding house, Hannah could not stop thinking about Xander Calloway, about the way he had looked at her Bible with hunger in his eyes, about the warmth of his hand and the deep rumble of his voice. She told herself it was simply the pleasure of finding someone interested in Scripture, but her racing heart suggested otherwise. The next afternoon, he was waiting for her when she emerged from the boarding house. He stood at the edge of the street with his hat in his hands, and Hannah felt her breath catch at the sight of him in full daylight. He looked even larger than she remembered, his buckskin shirt stretched tight across his chest and shoulders. The muscles in his forearms were visible where his sleeves were rolled up, and Hannah found herself staring before she caught herself. "I was not sure you would come," she said as she approached. "I said I would." Xander fell into step beside her, and Hannah noticed that people moved out of their way on the wooden sidewalk. The mountain man's presence seemed to command space without him saying a word. "I do not say things I do not mean." They returned to the bench outside the Mercantile, and Hannah opened her Bible. But before she could begin reading, Xander pulled something from the leather satchel at his side. It was a Bible of his own, clearly old and little used, the leather cover still stiff. "It was my mother's," he explained, seeing Hannah's expression. "I've carried it for years but barely opened it. Seemed like the time to change that." Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest. "That is wonderful, Xander. We can read together." And so began a ritual that would define the next weeks of their lives. Every afternoon, Hannah and Xander would meet at the bench and read Scripture together. At first, Hannah did most of the reading while Xander listened and asked questions. But gradually, he began to read aloud himself, his deep voice wrapping around the ancient words in a way that made Hannah's spine tingle. They started with the love poetry of Solomon, But Hannah soon introduced him to other passages. She showed him the Psalms with their raw expressions of joy and anguish. She read him the story of Ruth and her devotion to Naomi. She shared her favorite verses from the Gospels, the ones about love and forgiveness and grace. Xander absorbed it all like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water. He asked questions that showed he was truly thinking about what he read. He challenged interpretations and offered his own observations, often startlingly insightful for someone so new to serious scripture study. But it was not just the Bible reading that drew them together. As the days passed, they began to talk about other things. Xander told her about life in the mountains, about tracking elk through snow-covered passes and watching eagles soar above glacial lakes. He spoke of the terrible loneliness and the magnificent beauty, of seasons spent with no human company but his own thoughts. Hannah, in turn, told him about her life back in Ohio, where her father had been a minister until his death 2 years prior. She spoke of her mother's passing when Hannah was only 16, of the aunt who had raised her after that and died just 6 months ago, leaving Hannah alone in the world. "That is why I came west," she admitted one afternoon as they sat watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. "I had no family left, no prospects. A friend of my father's wrote saying there was need for a school teacher here in Shoshone City. It seemed like Providence." "Do you miss Ohio?" Xander asked. Hannah considered the question. "I miss having roots, belonging somewhere. But I do not miss the life I had there. I was always too intense for that town, too passionate about things that did not matter to other people. Here, I thought, perhaps I could start fresh." "And has it worked?" She laughed, but there was bitterness in it. "You have heard the women talk about me. I am as much an outsider here as I was there." Xander was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not an outsider to me." Hannah turned to look at him, and the expression on his face made her heart skip. There was something tender in his eyes, something that went beyond friendship or casual acquaintance. She saw longing there, and loneliness, and a growing affection that mirrored what she felt blooming in her own chest. "Xander," she said softly, but she did not know how to finish the sentence. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her face. His fingers were gentle despite their roughness, and Hannah felt herself leaning into his touch without conscious thought. "I have been alone for a long time," Xander said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Told myself I preferred it that way, that people were too complicated, too painful. But sitting here with you these past weeks, reading those words about love and devotion, I'm starting to think I was wrong." "What are you saying?" Hannah's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I am saying that you read the Bible like a love letter, Hannah Miller, and somewhere along the way I started reading you the same way, studying every word you say, memorizing the way you tilt your head when you are thinking, learning the sound of your laugh and the light in your eyes when you talk about things that matter to you." Hannah's breath had stopped somewhere in her lungs. She stared at Xander, at this powerful mountain man who looked at her like she was something precious and rare, and felt her world tilt on its axis. "I barely know you," she managed to say, though even to her own ears it sounded like a weak protest. "Then let me court you properly," Xander replied. "Let me show you who I am, and you can decide if a mountain man who is learning to read the Bible like a love letter might be worthy of your affection." The storm clouds had moved closer, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Xander stood and offered Hannah his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her to her feet and did not let go. They ran together through the sudden downpour, laughing like children, until they reached the covered porch of the boarding house. Hannah stood there dripping and breathless, and when Xander smiled at her, his teeth white against his beard, she felt something inside her give way completely. She was falling in love with this man, had been falling since the moment he sat down beside her and asked her to teach him to read with passion. "Yes," she said. Xander's smile widened. "Yes? Yes, you may court me. Though I warn you, I have no experience with such things. My whole life has been books and scripture and solitary contemplation." "And my whole life has been mountains and trapping and solitude," Xander countered. "We will learn together." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and tender that Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. Then he stepped back into the rain, replacing his hat on his head. "I will see you tomorrow, Hannah." She watched him disappear into the gray curtain of rain, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. Behind her, she heard the sharp intake of breath that meant Mrs. Dawson had witnessed the entire exchange. Hannah did not care. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Hannah had imagined. Xander was not a man of polite society or refined manners. He did not bring her flowers or write her poetry. Instead, he showed her his world in 100 different ways. He took her riding into the foothills on a gentle mare he borrowed from the livery, teaching her how to read the land the way he did. He showed her where mountain lions left their marks on trees and how to tell fresh elk tracks from old ones. He pointed out the places where wildflowers would bloom in spring and where the best fishing holes could be found. In turn, Hannah continued their Bible reading, but now it took on new dimensions. When they read about Jacob working 7 years to win Rachel's hand, Xander said he understood that kind of devotion. When they read about the love between David and Jonathan, Hannah spoke of friendship that transcended circumstance. And when they returned again and again to the Song of Solomon, they both fell silent, the words too charged with meaning to discuss aloud. The people of Shoshone City watched their courtship with fascination and disapproval in equal measure. The rough mountain man and the intense Bible-reading spinster made an unlikely pair. But Xander paid them no mind, and Hannah found she cared less and less what others thought. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Xander took Hannah to his cabin in the mountains. It was a full day's ride from town, up trails that wound through pine forests and across rushing streams. The cabin sat in a clearing with a view of the Sawtooth Peaks that gave the range its name, a solid structure built from logs Xander had cut and notched himself. Inside, it was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed frame that Xander had clearly built with his own hands stood in one corner, covered with furs and wool blankets. Shelves held his few possessions, traps and hunting gear, some basic cookware, and now his mother's Bible, which he had been bringing back and forth to town. "This is where I live most of the year," Xander said, watching Hannah take it all in. "I wanted you to see it, to understand what kind of life I lead." Hannah walked to the window and looked out at the view. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, purple and blue and green, crowned with snow that never fully melted. It was beautiful and isolated and utterly unlike anything she had known in Ohio. "It is incredible," she said honestly. "Lonely, but incredible." Xander came to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "It has been lonely," he agreed, "but I keep thinking it would not be, with the right person. With someone who could love this place the way I do, who could find God in the silence and the wildness instead of just in churches and towns." Hannah turned to face him. They were standing so close that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Are you asking me something, Xander Calloway?" His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "I'm asking if you could see yourself here, with me, as my wife." Hannah's heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. "We have known each other less than 2 months. I know, and if you need more time, I will wait. I will court you for a year, 2 years, however long it takes. But I also know that I love you. Hannah Miller. I have loved you since the day I heard those women gossiping and decided that anyone who read the Bible like a love letter was someone I needed to know. I love your passion and your intelligence and the way you see beauty in words I had read 100 times without truly seeing. I love that you are not afraid of silence or solitude. I love that you look at these mountains and see what I see." Tears were streaming down Hannah's face now, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been so afraid to admit it, even to myself, afraid it was too fast, too intense, but I cannot deny it anymore. I love you, Xander. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love the way you listen when I read, like every word matters. I love that you wanted to learn to see Scripture through my eyes. I love who you are, mountain man and all." Xander's smile was radiant. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her. It was Hannah's first kiss, and it was everything she had never dared to dream. His lips were warm and firm, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her melt against him. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, and she could feel the powerful beat of his heart through his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Hannah. Let me spend the rest of my life reading the Bible like a love letter with you. Let me show you every corner of these mountains. Let me build you a life here that is worthy of your courage and your faith." "Yes," Hannah said, the word coming out somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Shoshone City. The minister who had recruited Hannah to teach school performed the ceremony, and a handful of townspeople attended out of curiosity. Hannah wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself, and Xander had trimmed his beard and pulled his hair back neatly, though he still looked like exactly what he was, a man of the wilderness. When the minister asked if they had vows prepared, Xander surprised everyone by pulling out his mother's Bible and reading from the Song of Solomon. His deep voice filled the small church as he read about love being strong as death, about finding the one his soul loved. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she listened to this powerful man read the same words she had read to him that first day, now infused with all the meaning they had discovered together. Then it was Hannah's turn, and she read from Ruth. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." When they kissed as husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause. Even Mrs. Dawson, who had been so disapproving of Hannah's intensity, wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief. The newlyweds spent their first night together at the boarding house, as Xander wanted to make the journey to the cabin in daylight so Hannah could see the trail properly. They lay together in Hannah's small bed, and Xander held her close while she trembled with nervousness and anticipation. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he murmured against her hair. "I can wait." But Hannah shook her head. "I am ready. I'm just nervous. I know." His hand stroked down her back in a soothing rhythm. "Neither have I." Hannah pulled back to look at him in surprise. "Truly?" Xander nodded, his expression serious. "I told you I have been alone in those mountains since I was 18. I meant alone in every sense. I never wanted to be with anyone the way I want to be with you." The knowledge that they would discover this together, that she was his first as he was hers, eased Hannah's nervousness. She reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers clumsy but determined. Xander helped her, then returned the favor with her dress, his movements slow and reverent. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaking. Xander was careful with his considerable strength, mindful of Hannah's inexperience, and Hannah discovered that the same intensity she brought to Scripture could be brought to this as well, this physical expression of the love that had grown between them. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Xander traced lazy patterns on Hannah's bare shoulder. "I never knew it could be like that," he said softly, "like a prayer and a celebration all at once." Hannah smiled against his chest. "Everything can be a prayer if you approach it with the right heart. That is what I have always believed." "Then I will pray with you every day for the rest of our lives, Mrs. Calloway." The name sent a thrill through Hannah. Mrs. Calloway. She was no longer alone in the world. She had a husband, a home, a future stretching out before her like the endless mountain ranges. They left for the cabin the next morning, Hannah's few belongings packed on the gentle mare Xander had purchased for her. The ride took most of the day, and by the time they arrived, the sun was setting behind the peaks in a blaze of orange and gold. Xander carried Hannah over the threshold, another old tradition that made her laugh with delight. Then he set her down in the main room of the cabin and watched nervously as she looked around with fresh eyes. "I know it is not much," he said, "but I can add on. Build you a proper kitchen, maybe a separate room for children someday, if God blesses us." Hannah turned to him with shining eyes. "It is perfect. It is home." And it was. Over the following weeks and months, Hannah settled into her new life with a contentment she had never known. She had resigned from her teaching position, much to the school board's dismay, but she found she did not miss it. Her days were full in different ways now. She learned to cook over an open fire and then over the iron stove that Xander installed for her. She learned to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter, to bake bread in a Dutch oven, to sew and mend the heavy clothing they needed for mountain life. She learned to shoot a rifle, though she never liked it, and to read the weather by the behavior of the animals. But she also kept up her Bible reading, and Xander joined her every evening without fail. They would sit together by the fire, reading aloud to each other, discussing interpretations and applications. Sometimes they read other books too, poetry and philosophy and the handful of novels Xander had accumulated over the years. But they always came back to Scripture, approaching it together with the same passion and devotion that had first drawn them to each other. Winter came early that year, settling over the mountains in October with the first major snowfall. Xander had warned Hannah that they would be snowed in for months, completely isolated from the outside world. She had nodded, thinking she understood. But the reality was both harder and more wonderful than she had imagined. The snow piled up higher than the cabin windows. The world became a monochrome landscape of white and gray, with only the dark trunks of the pine trees breaking the uniformity. The wind howled down from the peaks and rattled the cabin walls. The cold was so intense that water left in a bucket overnight would freeze solid. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and light and love. Xander kept the fire burning constantly, rising in the night to feed it more wood. They slept together under piles of furs and blankets, their bodies generating heat and comfort. They talked for hours, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. They made love with increasing confidence and passion, discovering new ways to bring each other pleasure. And they read. They read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, discussing every book, every passage, every verse that caught their attention. Xander's insights continued to surprise and delight Hannah. His perspective, shaped by years of solitude and struggle in the wilderness, brought new dimensions to familiar stories. This passage about Moses spending 40 years in the desert before God called him, Xander said one evening, his finger tracing the words in Exodus. I understand that now. The wilderness strips away everything that is not essential. It teaches you to hear the still, small voice because there is nothing else to hear. Hannah leaned against his shoulder, her own Bible open in her lap. You are a poet, Xander Calloway. I am a man who has learned to read Scripture like a love letter, he corrected with a smile. You taught me that. We taught each other, Hannah said softly. I never understood the living quality of these words until I saw them through your eyes. You make the ancient stories come alive. As winter deepened, Hannah began to suspect that she was pregnant. Her monthly courses stopped, and she felt a persistent queasiness in the mornings. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain, but Xander noticed her pallor and the way she pushed away her breakfast. Are you ill? He asked with concern, his hand coming to rest on her forehead to check for fever. Hannah caught his hand and pressed it to her still flat belly instead. Not ill, she said, unable to keep the smile from her face. Expecting. Xander's eyes went wide. For a long moment, he just stared at her, and Hannah felt a flutter of worry. They had not discussed children specifically, though they both wanted them eventually. But perhaps it was too soon. They had only been married 4 months, and winter was not the best time for a pregnancy in such an isolated place. Then Xander let out a whoop of joy that rattled the rafters and swept Hannah into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin. A baby! Hannah, we are going to have a baby! His joy was infectious, and Hannah found herself laughing and crying at the same time. When he finally set her down, he immediately became protective, insisting she sit down, that she should not strain herself, that he would do all the heavy work from now on. Xander, I am not made of glass, Hannah protested, but she loved his concern all the same. He knelt before her, his hands gentle on her belly. When? He asked. I think late spring or early summer. May or June, if I am calculating correctly. Before the snows melt enough for us to get to town, Xander said, his expression growing serious. I will have to deliver the baby myself. A flicker of fear went through Hannah, but she pushed it down. Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years. We will manage. I will make sure of it, Xander promised. I have delivered calves and foals. The principle should be similar. Hannah laughed despite herself. I am not a cow or a horse, Xander. No, you're my whole world, he said seriously, his blue eyes intense, and I will protect you and our child with everything I have. The long winter continued, and Hannah's belly began to swell with their growing child. Xander became even more attentive, if that was possible. He made sure she had the best portions of meat, that she drank plenty of water, that she rested when she needed to. He rubbed her feet when they swelled and her back when it ached. He read to her for hours when she felt too tired to read herself. They chose names together during the long evenings by the fire. If the baby was a boy, they would name him Samuel, after Hannah's father. If a girl, they could not quite agree. Hannah liked Elizabeth, while Xander preferred Catherine. They decided to wait and see what felt right when the baby arrived. In late May, when the snow was finally melting and the first green shoots were pushing through the earth, Hannah's labor began. It started as a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away. Xander had been cutting firewood when she called for him. He dropped the axe mid-swing and ran to the cabin, finding Hannah doubled over beside the bed, her water having broken. "It is time," she gasped, and Xander's face went pale beneath his tan. But he did not panic. He helped her onto the bed, which he had already prepared with clean linens. He washed his hands thoroughly and gathered the supplies they had set aside: more clean cloths, a sharp knife that had been boiled, string for tying off the cord. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Hannah had never known such pain existed. She screamed and wept and cursed and prayed, sometimes all at once. Xander stayed by her side through it all, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement, holding her hand so tightly she thought she might break his fingers. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her during a brief respite between contractions. "You can do this, Hannah. You can do anything." And somehow she did. As the sun set on the second day of labor, with Xander coaching her through each push, Hannah brought their child into the world. The baby emerged with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for such a small creature, and Xander's hands shook as he caught the slippery infant. "A boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hannah, we have a son." He cut and tied the cord with steady hands, then cleaned the baby gently before placing him on Hannah's chest. She looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt a love so overwhelming it dwarfed everything she had ever felt before. "Samuel," she whispered. "Hello, Samuel." The baby's eyes opened, unfocused but searching, and Hannah felt tears stream down her face. Beside her, Xander was crying too, his large hand cradling their son's head with infinite tenderness. "Thank you," he said to Hannah. "Thank you for this gift, for him, for everything." Hannah was too exhausted and overwhelmed to respond with words. She simply reached for Xander's hand and held it, the three of them connected in a moment of perfect grace. The weeks that followed were the hardest and most beautiful of Hannah's life. She was sore and tired, healing from the birth while also learning to care for a newborn. Samuel was a good baby overall, but he needed to eat constantly, and Hannah's body ached from nursing him. Xander took over every other task in the household. He cooked and cleaned, hauled water and chopped wood, tended to the animals they kept. He changed Samuel's cloth diapers without complaint and walked the floor with him when he cried at night. He was, Hannah thought, the most devoted father she could have imagined. As the summer progressed and Hannah regained her strength, they fell into a new rhythm. She would nurse Samuel while Xander read aloud from the Bible, his deep voice seeming to soothe the baby as much as the milk. They talked about how to raise their son, what values to instill in him, what kind of life to give him. "He should know both worlds," Hannah said one evening as she rocked Samuel to sleep. "The mountains and the town, the wilderness and civilization. He should be able to choose his own path." Xander nodded thoughtfully. "Agreed. I do not want him to feel trapped the way I did. But I also want him to know this." He gestured to the window, where the peaks were turning purple in the fading light. "To understand that there is holiness in the wild places, not just in churches and cities." "We will teach him," Hannah promised, "the way we teach each other, with love and patience and scripture." When Samuel was 3 months old and Hannah felt fully recovered, they made their first trip back to Shoshone City as a family. The journey was slower with a baby, and they had to stop frequently for Hannah to nurse him. But eventually they arrived, and the townspeople came out to marvel at the mountain man, his Bible-reading wife, and their healthy infant son. "Well, Mrs." Dawson said, peering at Samuel with grudging approval. "He is a fine-looking child. Takes after his father in size, I think." Hannah smiled. "He is perfect," she said simply. They stayed in town for a week, restocking supplies and allowing Hannah to visit with the few people she had come to consider friends. The minister who had married them asked if they wanted Samuel baptized, and they agreed, standing together in the small church while water was poured over their son's head. But both Hannah and Xander were eager to return to the cabin. Town felt too loud, too crowded, too full of judgment and expectation. The mountains called to them, promising peace and solitude and the freedom to live as they chose. The years that followed were good ones. Samuel grew into a bright, sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. He learned to walk on the rough ground around the cabin, to talk in sentences that showed his quick mind, to observe the natural world with the same attention his parents gave to Scripture. When Samuel was 2, Hannah became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and the labor, while still painful, was mercifully shorter. They welcomed a daughter whom they named Catherine, finally agreeing on the name when they saw her delicate features. 2 years after that came another son, whom they named Daniel, and 3 years later, a final daughter they called Lydia. The cabin that had once housed just Xander grew crowded with life and love and noise. Xander added rooms as promised, expanding the structure until it was a proper house. There was a larger kitchen for Hannah, separate bedrooms for the children, even a small room that served as a study where the entire family would gather each evening for Bible reading. The children grew up hearing Scripture read like love letters. They learned their letters from the pages of the Bible, practiced their reading on the Psalms and Proverbs. They heard the stories of David and Goliath, of Daniel in the lion's den, of Jesus feeding the multitudes, and they heard them read with passion and reverence, as if each word mattered more than gold. But they also learned practical skills. Xander taught all the children, daughters as well as sons, to track and hunt, to read the weather and the land. Hannah taught them to cook and sew, to read and write, to think critically and question deeply. Together, they raised their children to be capable and faithful, strong and compassionate. As the children grew older, the family made more frequent trips to Shoshone City. The town had grown too, becoming more civilized with each passing year. By the time Samuel was 10, there was a proper school, and Hannah and Xander had long discussions about whether to send their children there. They need to be around other children, Hannah argued, to learn social skills, to understand how to function in the wider world. But the values they will encounter there, Xander countered, the pettiness, the judgment, I do not want them poisoned by it. In the end, they compromised. During the school year, they rented a small house in town, and the children attended school while Hannah and Xander took turns going back to the cabin to tend to their trap lines and animals. It was not ideal, but it worked. The children thrived in school, showing the same intensity about learning that their mother had always possessed. Samuel, at 12, was already reading ahead of his grade level. Catherine had a gift for mathematics that astounded her teachers. Daniel showed artistic talent, filling paper after paper with sketches of animals and landscapes. And little Lydia, just starting school, already knew her alphabet and numbers better than children twice her age. But the family always returned to the mountains for summer, and that was when they truly came alive. They would ride out to the cabin in late May and not return until September, and those months were filled with work and play and worship. Hannah and Xander still read the Bible together every evening, though now they had an audience of 4 children who listened and asked questions and absorbed the lessons being taught. They had passed on their passion for Scripture to the next generation, just as they had hoped. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Hannah by taking her on a trip, just the 2 of them. Samuel, now 12, was old enough to watch his siblings for a few days. Xander packed supplies and led Hannah higher into the mountains than she had ever been before. They hiked for 2 days, climbing steep trails and crossing icy streams until they reached a high alpine meadow. It was June, and the meadow was carpeted with wildflowers, purple lupin, yellow glacier lilies, red paintbrush. Mountains surrounded them on all sides, and the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. "This," Xander said, gesturing to the scene before them, "is where I came when I first left civilization, where I spent my first winter alone. I thought then that this was all I would ever need, that the mountains and the solitude would be enough." He turned to Hannah, and she saw the depth of emotion in his blue eyes. "I was wrong. I needed you. I needed what you brought into my life. The passion, the faith, the love. I needed to learn to read the Bible like a love letter, and I needed you to teach me." Hannah felt tears slipping down her cheeks. After 10 years and 4 children, after countless days and nights together, he could still move her to tears with his words. "And I needed you," she said. "I was so lost, Xander, so alone and uncertain. I came to Idaho thinking I was seeking purpose, but I was really seeking connection. I was seeking someone who could understand my intensity, who would not be frightened by my passion." Xander pulled her close, and they stood together in the flower-filled meadow, the wind whispering through the grass around them. "I love you, Hannah Calloway, more than I did the day we married, which I would not have thought possible. You have given me everything I never knew I needed." "And I love you," Hannah replied, "my mountain man who learned to read with his heart instead of just his eyes, my partner in this beautiful, difficult, miraculous life." They made love there in the meadow, under the vast sky, with the same passion and tenderness they had brought to each other since their wedding night. Afterward, they lay together wrapped in a blanket, and Xander pulled out his mother's Bible. "Read to me," Hannah said, settling against his chest. Xander opened to Song of Solomon, to the passage that had started it all. His voice rolled out over the mountains as he read. "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy fierce as the grave. Its flashes are flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord." Hannah closed her eyes and listened, and her heart was full to overflowing. This was what she had always sought in Scripture, not just doctrine or rules, but the living, breathing essence of love itself. And she had found it not only on the pages of her Bible, but in the man who held her, who had learned to read those pages with the same devotion she felt. They returned to their children renewed and refreshed, ready for the summer ahead. The months passed in a blur of activity, fishing and swimming in mountain lakes, picking berries and preserving them for winter, reading together in the long twilight evenings. As the children entered their teenage years, new challenges arose. Samuel, at 15, began to chafe at the restrictions of their isolated life. He wanted to see more of the world, to understand what lay beyond the mountains. Catherine, at 13, showed a similar restlessness, though hers manifested as a hunger for more formal education. Hannah and Xander talked long into the night about how to handle their children's growing independence. They prayed together, read Scripture seeking guidance, and ultimately decided that they had to trust the foundation they had built. "We have taught them to think for themselves," Hannah said, "to question and explore. We cannot now punish them for doing exactly that." "But I want to protect them," Xander said, the old protectiveness evident in his voice. "The world can be cruel and harsh." "It can also be beautiful and full of possibility," Hannah countered. "We have to let them discover that for themselves." So when Samuel asked to spend a year in Boise, the territorial capital, working for a newspaper and attending school there, they agreed. It was one of the hardest decisions Hannah had ever made, watching her firstborn ride away with just his belongings and their blessings, but she knew it was necessary. Samuel wrote letters home regularly, full of observations about city life and the people he was meeting. He wrote about the injustices he was witnessing, the treatment of Chinese immigrants who had come to work the mines, the casual cruelty directed at the Native Americans who still lived on the edges of civilization. His letters showed that he had absorbed his parents' values, that he saw the world with compassionate eyes. He returned after a year, taller and more confident, full of stories and ideas. He had not lost his faith or his connection to his family. If anything, his time away had strengthened his appreciation for what he had. "I met so many people who do not have what we have," he told his parents on his first night home. "They have money and position and education, but they do not have the kind of love that fills this house. They do not read the Bible like a love letter. They do not see God in the everyday things. I am grateful for what you have given us." Hannah embraced her son, tears streaming down her face. This was the fruit of their labors, children who understood what truly mattered, who could navigate the wider world without losing themselves. The years continued to pass. Catherine followed her brother to Boise for schooling and eventually became a teacher herself, returning to Shoshone City to educate the next generation. Daniel, true to his artistic nature, became known for his paintings of mountain landscapes and wildlife. His work eventually displayed in galleries in larger cities, and Lydia, the youngest, showed the same passion for Scripture her mother had always possessed, though she channeled it differently, working with the church to help those in need. Through it all, Hannah and Xander remained at the center, the foundation on which their family was built. They grew older together, Xander's dark hair becoming streaked with silver, Hannah's developing threads of gray. Lines appeared on their faces, marks of laughter and worry and the passage of time. But their love remained constant. Every evening, no matter what else was happening, they read the Bible together. Sometimes it was just the two of them, other times surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren. But always, they approached the ancient words with the same passion and devotion they had brought to them from the beginning. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration in Shoshone City. The whole town turned out, including many of the people who had once whispered about the strange Bible-reading woman and the wild mountain man. Now those same people spoke of the Calloways with respect and admiration, pointing to their children as proof that unconventional did not mean unsuccessful. During the celebration, Samuel stood to give a toast. He was 27 now, married himself with a son on the way, working as an editor for the newspaper in Boise, but visiting home regularly. Pray. "My parents taught us many things," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "They taught us to be self-sufficient and strong. They taught us to appreciate the beauty of the natural world. They taught us practical skills that have served us well. But most importantly, they taught us about love." He looked at Hannah and Xander, his eyes shining. "They taught us that love is not passive or tame, that it is fierce and passionate and consuming. They taught us to approach everything that matters with the same intensity they brought to each other and to their faith. My mother read the Bible like a love letter, and my father said he would read it too. And they have been reading it together ever since, teaching us all what devotion really means." The room erupted in applause, and Hannah reached for Xander's hand under the table. He squeezed it tightly, and when she looked at him, she saw the same love in his eyes that had been there on their wedding day. 25 years, he murmured, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "As would I," Hannah replied. "Every joy, every challenge, every moment, with you, always with you." As they entered their later years, Hannah and Xander gradually spent more time at the cabin and less in town. Their children were grown and settled, no longer needing their constant presence. They could return to the rhythm they had established in their early years, the solitude and simplicity of mountain life, punctuated by visits from family. The cabin had become a gathering place for the extended Calloway clan. Grandchildren would come to spend summers with their grandparents, learning to fish and track just as their parents had. Hannah and Xander delighted in these visits, in the noise and chaos that filled their home again, but they also treasured the quiet times when it was just the two of them. They moved more slowly now, their bodies bearing the marks of age and hard work. Xander's knees ached on cold mornings, legacy of decades spent hiking rough terrain. Hannah's hands sometimes cramped from arthritis, making it harder to turn the pages of her beloved Bible. But they adapted. Xander built Hannah a more comfortable chair with extra cushions for her back. Hannah read aloud when Xander's eyes grew tired, her voice still strong and clear. They took care of each other with the same devotion they had always shown, their love deepening with each passing year. On a crisp autumn evening when Hannah was 58 and Xander 64, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Hannah's Bible lay open in her lap, and Xander's arm was around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Giving up your solitude for marriage and children and all the complications that came with it?" Xander looked at her in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" Hannah shrugged, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I was just thinking about that first day. When those women said I read the Bible like a love letter, and you sat down beside me and said you would read it too. Did you have any idea where it would lead?" "No," Xander admitted. "I just knew that anyone who could bring that much passion to Scripture was someone I needed to know. I thought maybe you could teach me something about faith. I had no idea you would teach me about love instead, or that they would turn out to be the same thing." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "You taught me just as much. I'd been so alone for so long." pouring all my intensity into books and religion because I had nothing else. You showed me that passion was not something to be ashamed of or hidden. You matched my intensity and raised it. You loved me, not in spite of who I was, but because of it. And you saw past the rough exterior to the lonely man inside, Xander replied. You did not try to civilize me or change me. You just loved me as I was and invited me into your world of words and faith. Together, we built something neither of us could have created alone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade and the stars begin to emerge. Then, Hannah opened her Bible and began to read from Song of Solomon, the familiar words that had woven through their entire relationship. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it, she read. If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. Xander picked up the reading, his voice blending with hers. We have a little sister, and she has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? They read together, trading verses back and forth, their voices creating a harmony that echoed across the mountains. And as they read, Hannah felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for the courage that had brought her west, for the curiosity that had made Xander sit down beside her, for the faith that had sustained them through all the years. Their life had not always been easy. There had been hard winters and lean times, illnesses and injuries, disagreements and doubts. But through it all, they had held fast to each other and to the love that had first drawn them together. They had read the Bible like a love letter, and in doing so, they had learned to read each other the same way, with attention and devotion and an endless capacity for discovery. As they entered their 70s, both Hannah and Xander's health began to decline more noticeably. Xander's heart grew weak, and he could no longer make the long hikes into the high country he had once traversed with ease. Hannah's vision deteriorated, making it difficult for her to read the small print of her Bible, but they adapted once more. Their children brought them a Bible with large print, easier on Hannah's failing eyes. Xander took medicine for his heart and rested more, content to sit and listen while Hannah read. They had help now. Catherine had moved back to the cabin to care for her parents, bringing her own husband and children with her. The cabin was full again, 3 generations living under one roof. It was noisy and sometimes chaotic, but Hannah and Xander loved it. They were able to watch their grandchildren grow, to pass on their stories and their faith to yet another generation. One spring morning, when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom, Xander did not wake up. He passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand still holding Hannah's, his face serene in death as it had been in life. Hannah's grief was profound. After 52 years of marriage, she felt like half of herself had been torn away. She sat beside Xander's body for hours, holding his cooling hand, reading passages from Song of Solomon through her tears. Love is strong as death, she whispered, but death is still death, my darling, and I must learn to go on without you. They buried Xander on the hillside above the cabin, in a spot where he could look out over the mountains he had loved so much. The entire family gathered for the service, along with what seemed like half the population of Shoshone City. Samuel gave the eulogy, speaking of his father's strength and gentleness, his devotion to family and faith. But it was Hannah who insisted on reading the final scripture. Standing beside her husband's grave, her voice wavering but clear, she read from the Gospel of John. Let not your hearts be troubled, she read. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am you may be also. She closed the Bible and looked out at her assembled family. Xander taught me that the wilderness can be holy, that solitude can bring you closer to God, that reading the Bible with passion is not strange but sacred. He was my partner, my love, my dearest friend. And though I grieve his absence, I do not doubt that I will see him again, because love is strong as death, and the love we shared transcends even that final separation. Hannah lived for 5 more years after Xander's death. She remained at the cabin, cared for by Catherine and surrounded by family. Her body grew frail, but her mind stayed sharp until the very end. She spent her days reading her Bible, the pages now so worn that some were nearly transparent and telling stories about Xander to any grandchild who would listen. "He was a mountain of a man," she would say, her eyes distant with memory, "strong and powerful, with muscles like iron and a heart even stronger. But he was gentle too. So gentle with me, with you children, with anything small or helpless. He read the Bible like a love letter because I showed him how, and together we built a life on that foundation of faith and devotion." On a summer evening in 1933, with the scent of pine drifting through her open window and her great-grandchildren playing in the yard below, Hannah Miller Calloway passed away peacefully. She was 79 years old. Her Bible lay open on her chest to Song of Solomon, and those who found her said she had a smile on her face. They buried her beside Xander on the hillside, and the entire family gathered once more. The youngest great-grandchildren did not really understand what was happening, but the older ones knew they were witnessing the end of an era. Samuel, now 72 himself and silver-haired, stood before his mother's grave and spoke of her legacy. "My mother was a woman of passion and conviction," he said. "In a time and place that did not always appreciate such qualities in women, she remained true to herself. She read the Bible like a love letter, and she loved my father with the same intensity. Together they showed us what marriage should be: a partnership of equals, a blending of strengths, a commitment that endures through every trial." He paused, looking out at the assembled family. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the fruit of Hannah and Xander's love. They gave us more than just life. They gave us an example of how to live, with passion and purpose, with faith and devotion, with love that is fierce enough to move mountains. The family sang hymns as they lowered Hannah's coffin into the ground, their voices rising into the clear mountain air. And when the last shovel of earth had been placed, they stood together in silence, remembering the woman who had started it all by simply being herself. In the years that followed, the cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations. Samuel's son took it over first, then his grandson after that. It was expanded and modernized, but the original room where Hannah and Xander had first lived together was preserved exactly as it had been. The two Bibles, Hannah's worn leather-bound volume and Xander's mother's book, were kept on a special shelf. And every generation of Calloways was raised hearing the story of how their ancestors had fallen in love over Scripture, how a mountain man had learned to read the Bible like a love letter because a passionate woman had shown him the way. The story became legendary in Shoshone City and the surrounding area. People spoke of Hannah and Xander with reverence, holding them up as an example of what love could be when two people truly committed to each other and to something greater than themselves. Young couples visiting the cabin would stand at the twin graves on the hillside and read the words carved into the simple stone markers. Hannah's read. She read the Bible like a love letter, and in doing so, taught others to read with their hearts. Xander's read. He said he would read it too, and found love, faith, and purpose in the pages. And though decades passed and the world changed in ways Hannah and Xander could never have imagined, their love story endured. It endured in the children they raised and the grandchildren who carried their blood. It endured in the cabin that still stood strong against the mountain winds. It endured in the two worn Bibles that had been their constant companions. But most of all, it endured in the lesson they had taught, that passion is sacred, that intensity in love and faith is something to be celebrated, and that when two people commit to reading life like a love letter together, they can create something that transcends time itself. The mountains stood eternal above the cabin, witness to the love story that had unfolded in their shadow. And in the whisper of the wind through the pines, those who listened closely could almost hear two voices reading together, blending in perfect harmony, speaking words of devotion that would never die. Hannah and Xander's story was one of transformation and discovery, of two lonely souls finding completion in each other. It was a reminder that love can strike like lightning in the most unexpected moments, that the right person can teach you to see the world in entirely new ways, and that a life built on shared passion and faith can weather any storm. They had started as strangers, on a dusty street in a frontier town, brought together by a casual comment and a moment of courage. They had become partners, lovers, parents, grandparents, and finally, Legends. Their love had been tested by isolation and hardship, by the demands of raising a family in the wilderness, by the inevitable challenges that come with any long marriage. But they had endured. More than endured, they had thrived, because they had understood from the very beginning that love required work and commitment, that it was not a passive emotion but an active choice made every single day. They had chosen each other over and over again for more than half a century, and in the end, that was their greatest legacy. Not the children they raised or the land they settled, but the example they set of what love could be when approached with the same devotion they brought to Scripture. They had read the Bible like a love letter, and they had read each other the same way, discovering new depths and meanings with each passing year. Their story was complete, every thread woven together into a tapestry of faith and love and family. There were no loose ends, no questions left unanswered. Hannah and Xander had lived fully and loved deeply, and when their time came, they had left behind a legacy that would inspire generations. In the small cemetery on the hillside, their graves stood side by side, just as they had stood side by side in life. And the mountains kept their eternal vigil, unchanging and steadfast, a fitting monument to a love that had proven itself as enduring as the ancient stones themselves.